Imagine a quiet country town where everyone knows each other and secrets seem impossible to hide. Oakville was the picture of American suburban perfection, until a forbidden passion between neighbors unleashed a series of events that culminated in tragedy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's case, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us. Also, leave your opinion about this case in the comments below. All of this because, behind the facade of a perfect life, Sarah was keeping an explosive secret that threatened to destroy two families and shake the foundations of an entire town. Betrayal, obsession, violence, and a fatal shot on a summer night. Discover how an extramarital affair transformed suburban paradise into a crime scene that shocked America. This is the story of how Oakville's hidden sins came to light, with deadly consequences. In the quiet suburban town of Oakville, nestled in the heart of Connecticut, life had always moved at a leisurely pace. The tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors created an atmosphere of tranquility that many residents cherished. It was a place where families put down roots, where children grew up playing in cul-de-sacs, and where neighbors gathered for weekend barbecues without a care in the world. This idyllic setting, however, was about to be shattered by a series of events that would forever change the fabric of the community. At the center of this unfolding drama was Sarah Thompson, a 38-year-old mother of two and a pillar of the Oakville community. Sarah had lived in the town for over a decade, having moved there with her husband Michael shortly after their marriage. She was known for her volunteer work at the local elementary school, her leadership in the Neighborhood Watch program, and her infectious laugh that could often be heard at community events. Sarah's best friend, Emily Rogers, lived just 3 houses down on Maple Street. The two women had been inseparable since Emily and her husband David moved to Oakville 5 years ago. They shared everything, from morning jogs to afternoon coffee dates, and their families often vacationed together. To the outside world, Sarah and Emily epitomized the perfect friendship, supporting each other through life's ups and downs. What no one in Oakville could have imagined was the secret that Sarah had been harboring for the past year. Behind the facade of her picture-perfect life, Sarah was engaged in a passionate affair with David Rogers, her best friend's husband. The illicit relationship had begun innocently enough. A lingering glance at a neighborhood pool party, a brush of hands while passing the salt at a dinner gathering. But over time, stolen moments turned into clandestine meetings, and what started as a flirtation evolved into a full-blown affair that threatened to tear apart two families and shake the foundations of their tight-knit community. The events that would ultimately lead to tragedy began to unfold on a warm summer evening in July. The annual Oakville Summer Festival was in full swing, with families gathered in the town square for music, food, and festivities. Sarah and Michael Thompson arrived early, setting up their lawn chairs near the bandstand. Emily and David Rogers joined them shortly after, their children racing off to the bounce house with the Thompson kids in tow. As the evening progressed, keen observers might have noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Sarah and David, the way their hands brushed against each other as they reached for drinks, or how they always seemed to end up standing next to each other during conversations. But in the jovial atmosphere of the festival, no one paid much attention to these small details. It was during the fireworks display that everything changed. In the darkness, illuminated only by the bursts of color in the night sky, Sarah and David slipped away from their spouses, using the excuse of taking the children to get ice cream. Instead, they found themselves in a secluded corner of the nearby park, locked in a passionate embrace. Unbeknownst to them, a teenage couple seeking their own private moment stumbled upon the scene, recognizing the adults immediately. Word spread quickly through the teenage grapevine, and by the next morning, whispers and rumors were circulating throughout Oakville. The town that had once seemed so idyllic was now buzzing with speculation and scandal. Sarah and David, oblivious to the fact that their secret was out, continued their affair, growing bolder and taking more risks. As the summer wore on, the atmosphere in Oakville grew increasingly tense. Neighbors who had once greeted each other warmly now exchanged wary glances. The once friendly gatherings on Maple Street became stilted and uncomfortable. Michael Thompson and Emily Rogers, still unaware of their spouse's betrayal, sensed the change in the air but couldn't quite put their finger on what was wrong. It was Emily who first began to suspect that something was amiss. She noticed changes in David's behavior, late nights at the office, sudden business trips, and a growing emotional distance. At first, she attributed it to stress at work, but as the weeks passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. One afternoon in late August, Emily decided to surprise David at his office, hoping to rekindle their connection with a spontaneous lunch date. As she approached the building, she saw David exiting, hand in hand with Sarah. The sight stopped her dead in her tracks, her world crumbling around her as the truth of their betrayal became painfully clear. Devastated and enraged, Emily confronted the pair on the spot. The ensuing argument drew the attention of passers-by, and soon, the secret that had been simmering beneath the surface of Oakville's placid exterior boiled over into public view. Sarah and David, caught red-handed, could only stand in stunned silence as Emily's anguished cries echoed through the streets. News of the confrontation spread through Oakville like wildfire. Within hours, it seemed that everyone in town knew about the affair. The community, which had prided itself on its close-knit nature, was now divided. Some rallied around Emily and Michael, offering support and condemning the actions of Sarah and David. Others gossiped endlessly, reveling in the scandal that had disrupted their otherwise mundane lives. For Sarah and David, the exposure of their affair brought a mix of relief and terror. On one hand, the burden of secrecy had been lifted. On the other, they now faced the daunting task of dealing with the consequences of their actions. Both of their marriages lay in tatters, their reputations were in ruins, and the future they had imagined together suddenly seemed far less certain. In the days that followed, Oakville became a town divided. The once friendly neighborhood watch meetings turned into heated debates about morality and trust. The PTA, which Sarah had once led with enthusiasm, now struggled to function as parents took sides in the ongoing drama. Even the local church, which had always been a source of unity in the community, found itself grappling with questions of forgiveness and judgment. As summer gave way to fall, the initial shock of the revelation began to wear off, but the repercussions continued to ripple through the community. Michael Thompson, who had been the last to learn of his wife's infidelity, retreated into himself, rarely leaving the house except to go to work. His pain and humiliation were palpable, and neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now averted their eyes, unsure of what to say. Emily Rogers, on the other hand, channeled her pain into action. She filed for divorce, throwing herself into the process with a determination that surprised even those closest to her. She became an outspoken advocate for fidelity and trust, sharing her story on local radio shows and at community meetings. Her raw honesty and vulnerability struck a chord with many in Oakville, and she soon found herself at the center of a support network for others who had experienced similar betrayals. Sarah and David, meanwhile, were left to face the wreckage of their choices. Initially, they clung to each other, convinced that their love could withstand the storm of public opinion. They moved in together, renting a small apartment on the outskirts of town, away from the judging eyes of their neighbors. But as the weeks passed, the reality of their situation began to set in. The passion that had fueled their affair began to wane in the face of real-world challenges. David, who had lost his job in the wake of the scandal, struggled to find new employment. Sarah, ostracized from her former social circles, found herself isolated and increasingly depressed. The dream of a new life together, which had seemed so attainable in the heat of their affair, now felt like a distant fantasy. As autumn progressed, tensions in Oakville continued to simmer. The town, which had once prided itself on its sense of community, now felt fractured and uncertain. Long-standing friendships were tested as people were forced to choose sides. The annual Harvest Festival, usually a highlight of the town's social calendar, was a subdued affair, with many residents choosing to stay home rather than face the awkwardness of public gatherings. It was against this backdrop of tension and unease that the events of October 15th unfolded, a day that would forever change the course of Oakville's history and the lives of all those involved in this tangled web of love, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, with a hint of frost in the air. Sarah Thompson woke early, her mind racing with thoughts of the life she had left behind and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As she sipped her coffee, staring out the window of the small apartment she now shared with David, she couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. Across town, Emily Rogers was also awake, preparing for another day of meetings with her divorce lawyer. The past few months had taken their toll, leaving her exhausted and emotionally drained. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was determined to move forward, to rebuild her life on her own terms. Michael Thompson, still living in the house he had once shared with Sarah, went through the motions of his morning routine mechanically. The pain of betrayal had dulled to a constant ache, but the anger, at Sarah, at David, at the unfairness of it all, still burned hot within him. As he left for work, he couldn't have known that this day would bring a confrontation that would change everything. The catalyst for the day's events came in the form of a chance encounter at the local supermarket. Sarah, venturing out for groceries, found herself face to face with Michael for the first time since the affair had been exposed. The air between them crackled with tension as they stood in the produce aisle, surrounded by the mundane trappings of everyday life. "Michael," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. For everything." Michael's face hardened, his eyes cold as he looked at the woman he had once loved more than anything in the world. "Sorry doesn't begin to cover it, Sarah," he replied, his voice low and controlled. "You destroyed our family. You destroyed me." The exchange, brief as it was, left Sarah shaken. She abandoned her shopping cart and fled the store, tears streaming down her face as she drove back to the apartment. The encounter had brought all of her guilt and regret rushing back to the surface, forcing her to confront the reality of the choices she had made. When David returned home that evening, he found Sarah in a state of emotional turmoil. She paced the small living room, alternating between tears and angry outbursts. "We can't go on like this, David," she said, her voice trembling. "We've ruined everything. Our families, our lives. For what? This?" David, caught off guard by Sarah's sudden breakdown, tried to calm her. "Sarah, we knew it would be difficult, but we love each other. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" But Sarah was beyond consolation. Months of guilt, shame, and isolation had taken their toll, and seeing Michael had been the final straw. In that moment, she made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events with devastating consequences. "I can't do this anymore, David," she said, her voice suddenly calm. "I'm going to talk to Emily. I need to make things right." David's face paled. "Sarah, no, you can't. It's too late for that. We have to move forward, not backward." But Sarah was adamant. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, leaving David calling after her in vain. As Sarah drove through the darkening streets of Oakville, her mind raced with thoughts of what she would say to Emily. How could she possibly explain or justify her actions? Would Emily even be willing to listen? She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice the car that had been following her since she left the apartment. It was only when she pulled up in front of Emily's house that Sarah realized the car behind her was Michael's. Her heart began to race as she watched him park and get out, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Michael, what are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking as she got out of her own car. "I could ask you the same thing," Michael replied, his tone icy. "Haven't you done enough damage, Sarah? Why can't you just leave Emily alone?" Before Sarah could respond, the front door of the house opened and Emily stepped out onto the porch. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene before her, Sarah and Michael facing off in her front yard, the tension between them palpable. "What's going on here?" Emily demanded, her voice sharp with anger and confusion. The situation quickly escalated as all three began to speak at once. Sarah, trying to explain her desire to apologize and make amends. Michael, accusing Sarah of trying to manipulate the situation further. And Emily, caught in the middle, her emotions swinging wildly between rage and disbelief. It was in the midst of this chaos that David arrived, having followed Sarah from their apartment. His presence only served to further inflame the situation, with Michael lunging at him the moment he stepped out of his car. What happened next would be pieced together later through witness statements and police reports. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of raised voices, would report seeing a violent struggle. There were shouts, the sound of breaking glass, and then, most chillingly, a single gunshot that shattered the night air. By the time the police arrived, summoned by frantic 911 calls from nearby residents, it was too late. Sarah Thompson lay motionless on Emily Rogers' front lawn, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. The gun that had ended her life was found nearby, its ownership a mystery that would perplex investigators in the days to come. As paramedics worked frantically to save Sarah, police began the task of sorting out the chaotic scene. Michael, David, and Emily were all taken into custody, each shell-shocked and offering conflicting accounts of what had transpired. The quiet town of Oakville, which had already been rocked by scandal, now found itself at the center of a murder investigation. The events of that fateful night would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come, revealing deeper layers of deception, passion, and tragedy that would forever change the lives of all involved. As news of Sarah Thompson's death spread through Oakville, the town was plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. The scandal of the affair had been one thing, but murder, this was beyond anything the residents had ever experienced. The once peaceful community now found itself under the glare of media scrutiny, with news vans and reporters descending on the town like vultures. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the police investigation moved quickly. The gun was identified as belonging to Michael Thompson, a fact that initially cast suspicion heavily in his direction. However, as detectives dug deeper, they found that the situation was far more complex than it initially appeared. Interviews with neighbors who had witnessed parts of the confrontation painted a chaotic picture. Some reported seeing Michael and David in a physical altercation, while others swore they had seen Emily with the gun at one point. The conflicting accounts only served to muddy the waters, making it difficult for investigators to piece together a clear sequence of events. As the investigation progressed, more details about the relationships between the four individuals involved came to light. It emerged that in the weeks leading up to the shooting, both Michael and Emily had received anonymous threatening letters, warning them to stay away and let things be. The letters, which were found during searches of their homes, added another layer of complexity to the case. David Rogers, who had initially been seen as a secondary player in the drama, soon found himself at the center of the investigation. Police discovered that he had a history of volatile behavior, including a restraining order filed by an ex-girlfriend years earlier. This information, coupled with his role in the affair, made him a person of significant interest to the detectives working the case. Emily Rogers, for her part, maintained that she had been inside the house when the shot was fired. However, gunshot residue was found on her hands, a fact that she struggled to explain. Her emotional state in the weeks leading up to the shooting became a focus of the investigation, with friends and family reporting that she had become increasingly erratic and unpredictable. As the days turned into weeks, the people of Oakville found themselves living in a state of suspended animation. The town that had once been known for its friendly atmosphere and community spirit was now viewed with suspicion and fear. Neighbors who had once chatted freely over garden fences now kept to themselves, unsure of who to trust. The impact of Sarah's death and the subsequent investigation reached far beyond the immediate circle of those involved. The local school system struggled to deal with the fallout as children of all ages tried to make sense of the tragedy that had occurred in their midst. The church, which had always played a central role in community life, found itself grappling with questions of forgiveness and judgment that had no easy answers. In the midst of this turmoil, one figure emerged as an unexpected voice of reason and compassion. Rebecca Chen, the owner of the local bookstore and a relative newcomer to Oakville, began organizing community meetings aimed at healing the rifts that had formed in the wake of the scandal and subsequent tragedy. Her efforts to bring people together, to encourage open dialogue and understanding, provided a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark time. As the investigation into Sarah Thompson's death continued, the once idyllic town of Oakville found itself grappling with a new reality. The sense of safety and community that had defined the town for generations was shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Residents who had once prided themselves on knowing their neighbors now found themselves questioning everything and everyone around them. The police investigation, led by Detective Lisa Hawkins, a seasoned investigator brought in from a nearby city, began to uncover layers of secrets and lies that went far beyond the initial affair. As she dug deeper into the lives of Sarah, David, Emily, and Michael, Detective Hawkins discovered a web of relationships and motivations that was far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. One of the first major breakthroughs in the case came when forensic analysis of the anonymous threatening letters revealed traces of DNA that didn't match any of the 4 main individuals involved. This discovery led investigators to expand their search, looking into other residents of Oakville who might have had a motive to intervene in the affair or its aftermath. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the case continued to grow. National news outlets descended upon Oakville, their satellite trucks lining the once quiet streets. Reporters camped out in front of the homes of those involved, hoping to catch a glimpse or a quote from anyone connected to the case. The constant media presence only added to the tension in the town, with many residents feeling like they were living in a fishbowl, their every move scrutinized and analyzed. As the investigation progressed, Detective Hawkins began to focus more closely on the events leading up to the night of the shooting. Through interviews with friends, colleagues, and acquaintances of all 4 individuals, a clearer picture of the dynamics at play began to emerge. It came to light that in the weeks before her death, Sarah had been making plans to leave Oakville altogether. Bank records showed that she had been withdrawing large sums of cash and had inquired about selling her share of a small business she co-owned with Emily. This information cast her confrontation with Emily on the night of her death in a new light. Was Sarah planning to confess and make amends, as she had told David, or was she preparing to flee? David Rogers, who had initially portrayed himself as caught up in a passionate affair he couldn't control, was revealed to have a more calculating side. Co-workers came forward with information about David's ambitions at work, including his desire to take over a project that Michael Thompson had been leading. The affair with Sarah, some suggested, might have been part of a larger plan to undermine Michael both personally and professionally. Emily Rogers, who had garnered much sympathy as the betrayed wife, was not without her own complications. Investigation into her background revealed a history of mental health struggles, including a brief hospitalization for depression several years earlier. Friends reported that in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death, Emily had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that Sarah and David were conspiring to take her children away from her. Michael Thompson, initially viewed as the wronged husband with a potential motive for revenge, proved to be more complex as well. Financial records showed that he had been facing significant business troubles, with his company on the verge of bankruptcy. The stress of his failing business, combined with the discovery of his wife's affair, had pushed Michael to the brink. Several witnesses reported seeing him in heated arguments with Sarah in the days leading up to her death, including one particularly volatile confrontation at a local restaurant. As these details emerged, the people of Oakville found themselves reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the individuals involved and about their community as a whole. The case had exposed the fragility of the facade of perfection that many in the town had worked so hard to maintain. The investigation took another unexpected turn when Detective Hawkins received an anonymous tip about a 5th person who had been present on the night of the shooting. This individual, described as a young man in his early 20s, had allegedly been seen running from the scene shortly after the gunshot was heard. This new information sent investigators scrambling to identify this mystery person and determine their role in the events of that night. As weeks turned into months, the case continued to dominate life in Oakville. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a sort of weary resignation. The town that had once been known for its quaint charm and tight-knit community was now infamous. A cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of even the most picture-perfect places. The annual Oakville Founders Day celebration, usually a highlight of the town's social calendar, was a subdued affair that year. The traditional parade was canceled, and the community picnic in the park was sparsely attended. As residents gathered in small groups, conversations inevitably turned to the case and its impact on their lives. It was during this period of uncertainty and tension that an unexpected voice emerged, offering a different perspective on the events that had torn the community apart. Tyler Thompson, Sarah and Michael's 17-year-old son, who had been away at boarding school when the affair and subsequent tragedy unfolded, returned to Oakville. Despite his young age, Tyler displayed a maturity and insight that surprised many in the town. In a heartfelt letter published in the local newspaper, he called for compassion and understanding, urging the community to withhold judgment and to remember the humanity of all those involved. "My mother made mistakes," Tyler wrote, "as did my father, and Emily, and David. But they were human beings, flawed and complex, just like all of us. Their actions have had devastating consequences, not just for our families, but for our entire community. But in this time of pain and confusion, we have a choice. We can let this tragedy define us, or we can use it as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become stronger as a community." Tyler's words struck a chord with many in Oakville. His call for empathy and healing provided a counterpoint to the anger and recrimination that had dominated discussions in the months since Sarah's death. Slowly, tentatively, some residents began to reach out to one another, to rebuild the connections that had been severed by suspicion and fear. As the investigation entered its fourth month, Detective Hawkins and her team finally caught a break. The DNA found on the threatening letters was matched to a local man named Jason Reeves, a former high school classmate of both Sarah and Emily. When brought in for questioning, Jason initially denied any involvement, but under pressure, he began to reveal a story that would add yet another layer of complexity to the already convoluted case. Jason confessed to having been in love with Sarah since their high school days. He had never acted on his feelings, but had remained a distant admirer, following her life from afar. When he learned of her affair with David, Jason claimed he felt compelled to intervene, believing he was protecting Sarah from making a terrible mistake. But as Jason's story unfolded, it became clear that his involvement went beyond the threatening letters. He admitted to being present on the night of Sarah's death, watching from the shadows as the confrontation unfolded. His account of the events of that night would prove to be the key to finally unraveling the mystery that had consumed Oakville for months. As Detective Hawkins pieced together Jason's testimony with the physical evidence and other witness accounts, a clearer picture of what happened on that fateful night began to emerge. The truth, as it turned out, was both simpler and more tragic than anyone had imagined. The investigation's findings, when finally made public, would shake Oakville to its core, forcing the community to confront hard truths about love, betrayal, and the consequences of keeping secrets. The resolution of the case would bring closure to some, but for many in Oakville, the scars left by these events would take years to heal. As the truth about Sarah Thompson's death came to light, the residents of Oakville found themselves grappling with a reality far more complex and heartbreaking than they had imagined. The final piece of the puzzle, provided by Jason Reeves's testimony and corroborated by forensic evidence, painted a picture of a tragic accident born out of a moment of intense emotion and chaos. According to Jason's account, corroborated by physical evidence, the confrontation on Emily's front lawn had indeed become physical, with Michael and David coming to blows, while Sarah and Emily argued nearby. In the heat of the moment, Emily had retrieved Michael's gun from his car, intending to threaten the others into leaving her property. However, in the struggle that ensued as Michael tried to disarm her, the gun had gone off accidentally, the bullet striking Sarah. The revelation that Sarah's death had been an unintended consequence of a moment of high emotion, rather than a premeditated act, sent shockwaves through the community. Emily Rogers, overcome with guilt and horror at what had happened, had initially been too shocked to speak about her role in the events of that night. Her silence, and the subsequent confusion, had allowed suspicion to fall on others and contributed to the months of uncertainty and fear that had gripped Oakville. As the full story became public, the legal proceedings began to unfold. Emily was charged with involuntary manslaughter, while Michael and David faced lesser charges related to their roles in the confrontation. Jason Reeves was charged with stalking and interfering with a police investigation for his role in sending the threatening letters and withholding information about the night of Sarah's death. The trials that followed were painful and divisive for the community. Each day brought new revelations about the private lives and secret motivations of those involved. The affair between Sarah and David was dissected in excruciating detail, their private messages and emails laid bare for all to see. Michael's financial troubles and Emily's mental health struggles became matters of public record, discussed and debated in living rooms and coffee shops throughout Oakville. As the legal proceedings dragged on, the town struggled to come to terms with what had happened and to find a way forward. The case had exposed the fragility of the carefully constructed facade of suburban perfection that Oakville had long prided itself on. The illusion of a community where everyone knew their neighbors and nothing bad ever happened had been shattered beyond repair. In the wake of the trials, Oakville began the slow, difficult process of healing. Community leaders, taking inspiration from Tyler Thompson's call for compassion, organized support groups and counseling services for those affected by the tragedy. The local church, which had initially struggled with how to respond to the scandal, became a center for reconciliation and forgiveness, offering a space for residents to come together and share their feelings without judgment. Rebecca Chen's bookstore became an unexpected hub for community healing. She organized a series of book clubs and discussion groups focused on themes of forgiveness, community, and rebuilding trust. These gatherings provided a safe space for residents to explore their feelings about what had happened and to begin to reconnect with one another. As months turned into years, Oakville slowly began to rebuild. The scars left by Sarah's death and the subsequent investigation would never fully heal, but the community found ways to move forward. New families moved into the homes left vacant by those involved in the tragedy, bringing fresh energy and perspectives to the town. The annual Founders' Day celebration, which had been so subdued in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, gradually regained its former spirit. Though it would never be quite the same as before, the event became a symbol of the town's resilience and determination to move forward while honoring its past. 5 years after Sarah Thompson's death, Oakville had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The experience had left its mark on every aspect of life in the town, from the way neighbors interacted with one another to the topics discussed in PTA meetings and town halls. There was a new awareness of the complexity of human relationships and the dangers of making assumptions about others' lives. Tyler Thompson, now a young adult, returned to Oakville to establish a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to promoting mental health awareness and supporting families in crisis. His efforts served as a reminder of the human cost of the tragedy and the importance of compassion and understanding in the face of human frailty. Emily Rogers, upon completing her sentence, chose to remain in Oakville, dedicating herself to volunteer work and becoming an advocate for mental health awareness. Her journey towards redemption was not easy, but her willingness to confront her past and work towards making amends earned her a measure of forgiveness from some in the community. Michael Thompson and David Rogers both eventually left Oakville, seeking fresh starts in other parts of the country. Their departures were met with mixed emotions by the townspeople, some of whom felt relief at closing this chapter of the town's history, while others recognized the loss of longtime community members, flawed though they may have been. As for Jason Reeves, his role in the tragedy served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the unintended consequences of well-meaning but misguided actions. After serving his sentence, he too left Oakville, but his story remained a topic of discussion and reflection for years to come. The legacy of Sarah Thompson's death and the events that followed would forever be a part of Oakville's history. But as time passed, the town found ways to incorporate this painful chapter into a larger narrative of growth, resilience, and the enduring strength of community bonds. Visitors to Oakville in the years that followed might not have immediately sensed the profound changes that had taken place, On the surface, it still appeared to be a quintessential American suburb, with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. But those who took the time to look closer would find a community that had been tested by tragedy and emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of the complex realities that lie beneath the surface of even the most picture-perfect facades. The story of Sarah Thompson, her affair, and its tragic consequences became more than just a scandalous chapter in Oakville's history. It evolved into a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of honesty, empathy, and the dangers of keeping secrets. In schools, churches, and community centers, the events were discussed as part of broader conversations about ethics, mental health, and the nature of community. As Oakville moved forward, it carried with it the lessons learned from this dark period. The town that had once prided itself on its perfection now found strength in acknowledging its imperfections. The tragedy had taught them that true community isn't built on the illusion of flawlessness, but on the ability to support one another through both triumphs and tribulations. In the end, the story of Oakville became one of transformation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of a community to heal, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. The scars remained, but they had become a part of the town's identity, a reminder of where they had been and how far they had come. And so life in Oakville continued. Children still played in the parks, neighbors still gathered for backyard barbecues, and the seasons changed as they always had. But beneath the familiar routines, there was a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature and the true meaning of community. Oakville had been changed forever, but in many ways, it had also been reborn,